I think that oftentimes, as I said, in Montreal, or I can't speak for the rest of Canada, I can say that in Montreal, and I do know that this is an exception for sex workers internationally, because internationally, police are the predominant perpetrators of violence against sex workers. And I had mentioned that there was intimidation and humiliation and harassment, but I wanted to talk for a second about some of the gendered nature of that. I think the reason there's less physical violence against women is because we're perceived as less of a threat. But the minute that women fight back, I think that changes. And so if you're fighting back against an arrest because the arrest to you feels like a form of violence, then violence can follow. And I think that's important to think about. The other part of the gendered nature is that some of the humiliations have really horrific consequences in women's lives. So there was like a massage parlor busted this summer where they paraded the women in their underwear naked in the street in front of media. So not only do the women's families find out, can they potentially be disseminated families, but their children find out, can be taunted at school, etc. I also think that women are often pawns in sort of war on gangs. So when the police are trying to crack down on X gang or X organized crime and are particularly, or X community who have nothing to do with organized crime, and are particularly cracking down on the men in the community, what we've seen is women are sort of used as pawns, as in perhaps if we can raid this place and humiliate the women, we'll have gotten a punch in against that X group. So we become sort of pawns in the middle of a battle that has relatively little to do with us. I want to talk about how our relationship with the police has evolved a little bit in Montreal, because one of the complicated things to keep in mind is that in some instances, some parts of the police have been the quickest to catch on to why decriminalization is necessary to stop violence. And that's ironic. And it's ironic that I can say that some police officers have been the quickest to get it, and unfortunately, and I consider myself a very proud feminist, some feminists have been the slowest to catch on to why it's necessary, which is a very sad and bizarre predicament. We convinced in close to the year 2000 the city to take an approach of what was called non-judicialization, which is that they would not apply the laws of criminalizing sex workers, that instead they would invest more funds in groups that offered social service and health outreach to sex workers, particularly those on the street. And we received some support from the police in this. In 2001, the project was announced, and there was insane, and I mean insane, backlash that came next. Predominantly, property owners and condo owners felt that the cost of their properties would go down. The city organized a certain number of consultations to explain the project. People showed up at the mic with baseball bats saying they were going to go get the prostitutes out of the neighborhood. And perhaps a very unoriginal biblical reference, people started throwing rocks at sex workers. We had tomatoes thrown at us. I'm happy they were tomatoes and not rocks. The second consultation had to be called off because of a bomb threat, and in like perhaps a very kitschy move, was moved to a church because it was the only place that they felt they could control some of the violence that was spilling out. A number of us received death threats. We're not sure from whom. People's children were mentioned on the death threats to Stella. Our windows were broken, dead animals were left on our doorstep. And we're not quite sure from whom. Our understanding is probably it was from property owners and big developers in the area who we know have unsavory connections. If we didn't know before, the last municipal election should have taught us all. Also reference season 5 of The Wire. But anyways. Or the other thought that crossed our minds was that it could have been people who controlled dope to a certain extent. Women who had dope debts were sometimes being forced to work under conditions they did not choose. And we wondered if potentially the threat was coming because women would now potentially be able to report those threats to police and potentially be able to get out of situations where they were being controlled or abused. What happened next, and I just want to explain this to frame some of the violence and some of the solutions that have been brought forward, and also to frame how some positive outcomes have come out in terms of us in the police. Which is, what happened next is the right-wing neighborhood associations banded with a group of feminists who are anti-sex work, and they pushed for what they called the Swedish model, which is a model predicated on the idea that all women in sex work are victims, and that all clients are essentially equivalent to rapists. And what they did is they arrested en masse the men and promised they wouldn't arrest the women because women are victims. And of course this never happens, they always arrest the women. And if they don't arrest them on prostitution charges, they'll go for homelessness-related charges or whatever. And what we saw was that as they arrested all the men, the pool of potential clients went down so that women could no longer choose. Like women, even women who are in really, really rough situations or dope sick or whatnot, often refuse clients if the client seems aggressive or drunk or dangerous, and no longer able to make the money because there were less clients. Women were going with clients that maybe their better judgment was that this is not a good guy, but if he was the only guy coming that night and they needed the $40 or the $80, then that's who they were going to go for. And so the supposed feminist measure of arresting clients resulted in 3 months in us seeing 3 times the level of violent attacks against sex workers reported and 5 times the level of attacks with a deadly weapon. And it seemed a very unfeminist measure to us. The police, perhaps began to see Stella as perhaps less of a threat. And I don't know if this was because we had managed to convince them of the importance of de-judicialization, and then when the threats happened, I think they realized that we knew what we were talking about. If violent people were threatened by us of removing the criminalization, well, it's because potentially we would be able to get to the source of the violence. I think they also took a shine to us because they got to play the knight in shining armor role, which was a little awkward for many of us. Because there were so many threats at us at these public hearings, the police often had to accompany us home so we wouldn't get beaten. Ironic. We started to do trainings of police in police academies. We started to meet with police and sit on city committees. So we sit in Saint-Michel and Maisonneuve in downtown on city committees with police. The other thing that happened is that the Picton murders happened, and the police inaction for 20 years allowed those murders to keep on happening, and I think that put a certain heat on the police. And so we've had police inspectors from major crimes and from the sexual assault unit who have approached us and worked with us when we have assisted women in reporting crimes. And they, in their own small way, and I doubt this is official policy, I think it's just them being pragmatic, have implemented what I call micro-decriminalization, which is to say that there are police inspectors who, if a woman has been raped or brutally attacked or murdered, we can go to, in the case that the woman is still alive, and they will not look at the woman's warrants unless she has a warrant out for homicide. They will not arrest her for sex work. They will not stop her from doing sex work. And they will not arrest her clients. So it's mini-decriminalization. And thanks to that, thanks to the fact that there are a few inspectors who are willing to do that, we've managed to support a number of women in bringing charges. Thanks to the fact that they have done that, there are 2 trials ongoing in Montreal of alleged serial rapists of sex workers, both of whom allegedly left the women for almost dead. There's, in the past fall, more and more women have come forward as they've seen that other women have been able to come forward. So in the past fall, we've been able to report an attempted murder, 2 assaults with a deadly weapon, which in my view should be attempted murders, but anyways. Rape, what else did we? Oh, confinement and torture, a few weeks. And so for us, it's become clear that these are tiny steps forward, but that it's no victory to be able to report serial rapists. The victory is if they weren't serially raping. And that will only happen when we're able to stop and change the laws. It'll only stop, in my view, when we're able to decriminalize sex work, when we're able to legalize drugs. The war on drugs has nothing to do with combating addiction. It has nothing to do with helping people who are struggling with addiction. It has everything to do with criminalizing poor people, particularly Black and Indigenous people. The same with the war on sex work, if you will. It has nothing to do with supporting women to have more choices in their life, to be in a more empowered position, to be in a healthier, safer place. It had everything to do with sending people to jail.